The moment you stop chasing, everything changes. There's a moment most people never notice until it's already too late. Not because somebody leaves, not because there's a fight, not because anything dramatic happens, but because emotional dynamics usually shift quietly long before they shift visibly. One reply becomes shorter, one pause becomes longer. One person becomes more emotionally aware than the other. And from there, the interaction slowly starts changing underneath the surface. Most people think attraction disappears suddenly, but most of the time, attraction fades through repeated emotional patterns. The rhythm changes, the balance changes, the emotional tension changes, and the moment somebody feels that shift, they usually react emotionally without realizing what they are actually doing. They explain more, they react faster, they try harder. They become emotionally available in ways they never were before. And ironically, that reaction often accelerates the distance they were trying to stop. Because people respond to emotional perception far more than they respond to words. The moment your behavior begins communicating fear, urgency, or emotional imbalance, the interaction starts feeling different, even if nothing negative was said directly. That is why overexplaining quietly changes attraction. Most people think overexplaining is communication. But usually, it is emotional reassurance. It is an attempt to reduce uncertainty, to restore stability, to remove emotional tension quickly. But grounded people do not panic every time energy changes. They notice the shift without emotionally collapsing into it. And that emotional steadiness creates psychological weight, because calmness changes perception. Most people think confidence looks loud, but real confidence usually looks emotionally stable. It looks patient, it looks grounded, it looks calm while uncertainty exists. That emotional steadiness becomes powerful because emotionally reactive people are extremely predictable. The second something changes, they react. The second they feel distance, they chase. The second uncertainty appears, they try to control the interaction emotionally, and people subconsciously feel that pressure. That is why silence changes dynamics so strongly. Not because silence is manipulation, but because silence removes emotional overexposure. The moment you stop trying to force emotional certainty, the interaction starts breathing differently. Now there is space again. Now there is tension again. Now your emotional state no longer feels completely predictable, and human attention naturally moves toward uncertainty. People observe what they cannot fully map. That is why somebody who once seemed distant may suddenly start paying closer attention after you emotionally pull back. Not because silence magically creates attraction, but because emotional certainty disappeared, and certainty without tension slowly weakens emotional intensity. This is also why replying too quickly can quietly change relationship dynamics. Most people think immediate emotional availability creates stronger connection, but often it removes anticipation. The emotional rhythm becomes too accessible, too predictable, too emotionally available, and while that may feel safe, it can slowly lower emotional curiosity underneath the interaction, because attraction depends heavily on emotional rhythm, not games, not manipulation. Rhythm, the balance between certainty and uncertainty. That balance disappears the moment one person starts emotionally overreaching for reassurance. This is why emotional self-control becomes so important. Not because it makes you cold, but because it prevents emotional overcorrection. Most people damage their emotional position trying to restore certainty too quickly. They feel distance and instantly react, but often the reaction itself becomes the thing that changes the interaction most. Now, every reply feels emotionally loaded. Every silence feels dangerous. Every pause feels personal. And the more emotionally reactive the interaction becomes, the harder it becomes for natural attraction to exist. That is why grounded people often appear more attractive psychologically, not because they care less, but because their emotional state is not fully controlled by another person's behavior. They remain emotionally centered even while uncertainty exists, and people instinctively feel that difference. This is where most people misunderstand emotional control. They think emotional control means suppressing emotion, but emotional control is emotional steadiness. It is the ability to pause instead of panic, to observe instead of instantly reacting, to allow emotional space instead of trying to control every emotional outcome immediately. That changes everything. Because emotional space allows tension to exist naturally, and tension keeps emotional attention alive. This is why people suddenly notice when you stop reacting the same way. Your emotional rhythm changes. Your presence feels different. Your silence feels intentional instead of emotionally urgent. And once emotional urgency disappears, perception changes underneath the interaction. People begin observing more carefully, listening differently, trying to understand what changed, because emotional unpredictability creates psychological focus. Again, not toxic unpredictability, not manipulation, emotional independence. The ability to remain emotionally balanced regardless of temporary emotional shifts. That emotional balance creates gravity. And gravity naturally pulls attention. Most people spend their lives emotionally chasing reassurance. They constantly need replies, validation, emotional clarity, or confirmation to feel stable. And because of that, their emotional energy becomes heavy. Every interaction begins carrying emotional pressure underneath it. People can feel when somebody desperately needs certainty. That pressure quietly changes attraction. Grounded people feel different because they are emotionally stable. They are not relying entirely on another person's behavior to regulate their emotional state. That creates emotional freedom. And emotional freedom changes how people experience your presence. This is also why emotionally reactive people often feel exhausted in relationships. Every delayed reply changes their mood. Every shift feels threatening. Every silence creates anxiety. And eventually, the interaction stops feeling emotionally natural. It begins feeling emotionally monitored. That is when attraction often starts fading quietly, not through one big mistake, but through repeated emotional overreaction. One emotionally urgent moment after another, until eventually the emotional tension disappears completely. That is why calmness becomes so powerful. Calmness removes pressure. Calmness allows space. Calmness prevents emotional overcorrection. And the moment somebody emotionally recenters themselves, the interaction often changes immediately underneath the surface. Now their behavior feels intentional instead of reactive. Now their silence carries emotional weight instead of anxiety. Now their energy feels grounded instead of emotionally urgent. And people notice that shift even when they cannot explain it logically. Because emotional dynamics are rarely about words alone. They are about patterns, rhythm, tension, perception, presence. Most people think they lost attraction because they said the wrong thing. But usually, attraction fades because the emotional pattern changed. Too much reassurance, too much reacting, too much emotional availability. Eventually, the interaction becomes fully predictable. And predictability without tension lowers emotional intensity over time. That is why emotional restraint becomes so important. Not emotional suppression, restraint. The ability to stay emotionally balanced while uncertainty exists. That emotional balance changes everything, because grounded people do not emotionally collapse during temporary emotional distance. They allow silence, they allow pauses, they allow emotional tension to exist naturally. And strangely, that often creates stronger emotional connection than excessive reassurance ever could. Because people respond more deeply to emotional presence than emotional explanation. The way you carry uncertainty changes how you are perceived. The way you respond to silence changes emotional tension. The way you handle emotional distance changes attraction underneath the surface. That is why the moment you stop emotionally chasing certainty, people begin experiencing you differently. Not because you became colder, but because your emotional energy stopped feeling desperate for control. And that is usually the real turning point. The moment somebody stops reacting from fear and becomes emotionally grounded again, because grounded energy changes every interaction around it. People trust it more, respect it more, pay attention to it more carefully. And most importantly, they feel less emotional pressure. That is why calmness becomes so powerful in relationships and human interaction. Calmness allows emotional tension to exist without forcing immediate resolution. And once you understand that, you stop overreacting to every emotional shift. You stop overexplaining every misunderstanding. You stop emotionally chasing reassurance every time uncertainty appears. That is when your presence starts carrying emotional weight. Because people respond differently to somebody who remains centered while uncertainty exists. And that is when everything underneath the interaction quietly begins changing.